You're standing on a river delta that will vanish tonight, though you don't know it yet. It's roughly 6200 BC, and the ground beneath your feet, dry, grassy, thick with deer tracks, will be 40 meters underwater within your children's lifetimes. Right now, though, the tide is doing something wrong. It's pulling back, fast, exposing seabed no living person has ever seen dry. And the silence where the surf should be is the loudest thing you've ever heard. You don't have a word for tsunami. You're about to learn what one does anyway. Compare that to your Tuesday. You check a weather app before you leave the house. Your insurance policy has a flood clause. Somewhere, a government agency is already modeling the storm that hasn't happened yet. And if the water rises, sirens tell you exactly when to run. Ancient humans didn't get a warning system. They got a coastline that lied to them, then took everything back at once. And somehow, across 10,000 years and half the planet, people kept living on the water's edge anyway. No hydrologists. No levee boards. Just memory, elevation, and whatever their grandparents managed to pass down before the next wave arrived. So, how did people survive floods large enough to erase entire countries overnight? And how did some of those floods stay remembered, accurately, for thousands of years after the water finally settled? In 2008, archaeologist Bernhard Wenninger and a team studying sediment cores across the North Sea dated the disaster precisely. A chunk of the Norwegian continental shelf, somewhere between 2,400 and 3,200 cubic kilometers of rock and mud, enough to bury a mid-sized country, broke loose underwater and slid. The wave it triggered hit the Shetland Islands at 20 meters. That's a 6-story building, moving, with nowhere flat to stop it. Along the Norwegian coast, the water arrived at 10 to 12 meters, still tall enough to erase a 2-story house. It struck what's now called Doggerland, the last dry remnant of a land bridge that had once connected Britain to mainland Europe, home to an estimated 1 to 3,000 Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. Everyone pictures a single dramatic wave wiping Doggerland off the map. That's not quite it. Rising seas had already spent 2,000 years slowly drowning the place, field by field. The tsunami didn't start the ending. It just finished it in an afternoon, instead of over another 2 centuries. So what actually happened to the people who lived through that? Here's where the story gets tangled up with religion. In 1929, archaeologist Leonard Woolley sank a pit roughly 75 feet by 60 into the ancient city of Ur in southern Iraq, and kept digging past the royal tombs, past 5,000 years of pottery and mud brick. About 12 meters down, his crew hit something strange. 8 straight feet of clean water-laid silt. No pottery, no bone, no trace of anyone at all. Picture the height of 2 grown men, stacked and directly beneath that layer, an older settlement from the Ubaid period, carrying on like nothing had happened. Woolley announced he'd found evidence for the Great Flood. Newspapers ran with it, worldwide, within weeks. Everyone assumes the Ur discovery proves one Bible-sized flood swallowed the whole planet. It doesn't. Woolley himself argued for something narrower, a catastrophic local flood of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, severe enough that, in his own words, to the people living there, it was the whole world. Similar silt layers later turned up at Kish and at Shiruppak, other river cities, other floods, a pattern repeating up and down the same river system for centuries, not one apocalypse, which raises an obvious problem. If the North Sea swallowed a country and half a dozen river cities got buried in mud, how would anyone today know what any of it looked like beforehand? Because someone went looking. Landscape archaeologist Vincent Gaffney at the University of Bradford has spent 2 decades doing exactly that, not by diving, but by combing seismic survey data that oil and gas companies collected to find fossil fuel, not a lost country. It started with accidents. In 1931, a trawler called the Kalinda dragged up a prehistoric bone harpoon 60 miles off the Yorkshire coast, still packed in a lump of peat. By 2025, Gaffney's team had mapped 188,000 square kilometers of the North Sea floor, an area roughly the size of England and Scotland combined, holding rivers, hills, and hunting grounds that were dry land within the memory of people who were still alive when the water finally closed over it, around 8,000 years ago. Here's where it gets strange, though. Everyone assumes that once the water comes for good, you run and you don't come back. Some communities did exactly the opposite, quietly, across an entire coastline for 2,500 years straight. In a 2026 study published in the journal Earth Science Reviews, Wageningen University landscape archaeologist Roy van Beek and his team cataloged nearly 9,000 artificial dwelling mounds across the Netherlands, 3 times more than anyone had previously counted. Starting around 500 BC, people in Frisia stopped retreating from the flood-prone marshes and started building upward instead, piling sod, clay, and manure into mounds that in some places rose as high as 15 meters, then and raising a whole village on top of that. A Roman writer later mocked these mound dwellers as sailors at high tide and castaways at low tide. He wasn't wrong. He'd also just described a system that worked. When the tide came in, the water went under them, not through them. And some of those same mounds are still lived on today, nearly 20,500 years later. So which is the real answer here? The tsunami, the silt, or the mound? None of them, on their own. Researchers still argue about exactly how hard the Storego wave hit the last remaining pockets of Doggerland. The physical evidence down south is thinner than the drama deserves. The mound and the memory, though, those you can still measure. Scientists used to assume oral storytelling couldn't survive more than a few hundred years without curdling into unreliable myth. In 2016, geographer Patrick Nunn and linguist Nicholas Reed broke that assumption by nearly 300 generations. They studied 21 Aboriginal Australian oral traditions describing coastlines that no longer exist, and found the details matched the geological sea level record from more than 7,000 years ago. No writing involved. No maps. Just a story, told the same exact way, generation after generation, accurate enough that a flood which predated Stonehenge was still being described correctly when British ships finally arrived on that coast. The mound kept people dry. The story kept people warned. Neither one worked without the other, and most cultures that survived the water long-term needed both. You're still standing on that delta, watching the tide pull back. Somewhere behind you, someone older is already shouting the word their grandmother used for this. The word that means run, now, uphill, and you move before you fully understand why. That's the whole trick. Not outrunning the flood. Remembering precisely enough exactly what it looks like right before it arrives. We built satellites that can see a storm coming 10 days out. We're still working on remembering anything for 10,000 years.